You are reading this because someone thousands of generations ago walked north instead of staying put. That's the assumption sitting underneath your entire identity, and you probably never examined it. Somewhere in your blood is a decision, a crossing, a leaving. But what if that decision had never been made? For most of the story of Homo sapiens leaving wasn't even on the table. Your species didn't come from everywhere. It came from one place. Fossils found at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco and dated by paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Soublin in 2017 pushed the origin of anatomically modern humans back roughly 300,000 years. Every one of those years happened on a single continent, Africa. For the vast majority of human history, everyone who ever lived, hunted, raised children, and died was African. Not originally African, just African. Full stop. No other continent had you on it yet. So ask yourself the real question. Not why they left. Ask this instead. What does the world look like if they simply didn't? Hold that question. We're coming back to it. Here's what actually happened as far as the evidence can tell it. There wasn't one clean walkout. There were false starts. Around 120,000 years ago, a small group of modern humans made it as far as the Levant into what's now Israel, leaving remains at sites like School and Kafse. And then, as far as the genetic record shows, that population simply fizzled out. A dead end. They didn't become you. Feel that for a second. Your existence wasn't guaranteed on the first attempt. It took a second try. The version of the migration that actually stuck happened later, somewhere around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. In 1987, biochemist Alan Wilson and geneticist Rebecca Cann traced the mitochondrial DNA of people across the globe back to a startlingly narrow point of origin, a finding the press nicknamed Mitochondrial Eve. The science didn't mean one literal woman existed. It meant something stranger. Every human outside Africa alive today descends from an almost absurdly small founding population. Some estimates put the number of people who successfully left at only a few thousand. A few thousand people. That's the entire bottleneck standing between you and never existing at all. Now here's where it gets heavier. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano erupted in what's now Indonesia, one of the largest eruptions in the last 2 million years. Geologist Stanley Ambrose proposed in 1998 that the resulting volcanic winter may have crushed human populations down to a genetic bottleneck so severe it nearly ended the species' expansion before it began. You don't get to feel safe reading that. Your ancestors weren't thriving explorers confidently spreading across a welcoming planet. They were a handful of survivors clinging to a thread line that could have snapped at almost any point along the way. Try to picture the actual crossing, not the abstract idea of it. A narrow strip of land and shallow water near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where the Red Sea narrows to barely a few kilometers wide. Low tide exposing a path of wet sand and reef rock. The smell of salt and dead fish carried on wind that never quite stops. A few dozen people, maybe fewer, carrying children on their hips and water in hollowed gourds, deciding in a single afternoon whether to keep walking east into land none of them had ever seen. There was no map. There was no guarantee the other side had food or fresh water or anyone friendly waiting. There was only the smell of the reef at low tide and a choice. That's the entire hinge of your existence. Not a grand expedition. A handful of exhausted people crossing wet rock because staying meant something worse. So picture the counterfactual seriously now. Not vaguely, specifically. If that thread line had snapped, if the small founding groups crossing into the Sinai or across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait near the Horn of Africa had died out the way the School and Kafse groups did, Homo sapiens simply stays home. Africa keeps its full population of modern humans. Nobody else has any. You've probably absorbed the assumption that the rest of the world was just empty waiting. It wasn't. Other hominins were already out there. Homo erectus had left Africa nearly 2 million years earlier and spread as far as Southeast Asia. Neanderthals were already established across Europe and Western Asia, built for cold in ways your species hadn't evolved for yet. Denisovans occupied stretches of Asia researchers are still mapping today. The world outside Africa wasn't a blank canvas. It was already inhabited, just not by anyone who looked like you. If sapiens never left, those lineages don't get replaced. They don't get outcompeted. They don't get absorbed. Neanderthals, according to the genomic work led by Svante Pääbo and published in 2010, contributed somewhere between 1% and 2% of the DNA in nearly every non-African person alive today, a genetic fingerprint left behind by interbreeding that could only happen because sapiens showed up in Neanderthal territory. No exit from Africa means no encounter. No encounter means no interbreeding, which means the DNA sitting in your genome right now, if you're of non-African descent, simply doesn't exist in this alternate version of you. You'd be missing a piece of yourself you didn't know you were carrying. Here's the twist most people get wrong when they picture this scenario. They imagine a smaller, quieter world. Less diversity, less history happening. The opposite is true. Population geneticist Sarah Tishkoff's research has repeatedly shown that Africa holds more human genetic diversity than the rest of the planet combined because everyone who left carried only a slice of the variation that stayed behind. A population bottleneck is exactly what it sounds like. A narrow opening that only lets a fraction of the original diversity squeeze through. Every non-African population on Earth today is, genetically speaking, a subset of what already existed in Africa 70,000 years ago. So if the migration never happened, you don't get a smaller human story. You get a larger one concentrated entirely on a single continent. Every branch of human variation still intact, still coexisting, still being reshaped by tens of thousands of additional years of separate evolution across deserts, forests, coastlines, and highlands that would never see a single Homo sapiens footprint. No Europe populated by your kind, no Americas, no Australia, no Asia settled by sapiens either. Agriculture, if it still arose independently the way it did in the Fertile Crescent and in Mesoamerica, would have had to happen entirely within African river valleys and highlands, the way it likely did anyway, independently in the Sahel, where sorghum and African rice were domesticated by communities archaeologists are still working to fully understand. Cities, empires, writing systems, the entire architecture of what you call world history, all of it compressed onto one landmass competing for space resources and time within a single continent's ecological ceiling. Now bring it back to you, because this was never really a question about the ancient past. It's a question about how thin the thread actually is that makes you you. You probably think of your identity, your ethnicity, your nationality, the language you dream in as something old, fixed, inevitable. It isn't. It's the downstream result of a migration that came within a hair's breadth of not happening at all twice, with a supervolcano wedged in between. Every border you've ever crossed, every passport you've ever held, every argument you've ever heard about, where someone is really from, all of it is downstream of a walk. A few thousand people made out of necessity, not ambition, tens of thousands of years ago. You are not the result of your ancestors' confidence. You're the result of their survival against odds that very nearly didn't break their way. Think about that the next time you fill out a form that asks for your race or your nationality or where your family is from. Those categories feel permanent because you were born into them the same way. The ground under your feet feels permanent because you've never seen it move. But the ground moves. It moved once decisively on a strip of exposed reef between two continents, and every category you now treat as fixed identity is just the sediment that settled afterward. Change the outcome of one narrow crossing 70,000 years ago, and none of it exists in its current shape. Not the borders, not the languages, not the arguments people have about who belongs where. Even the number of people alive on Earth right now would look almost nothing like it does. A species confined to a single continent, however genetically rich, runs into ecological ceilings that a species spread across 6 continents simply doesn't face. Fewer landmasses to farm, fewer river systems to build cities beside, fewer isolated environments to force independent invention of the wheel of writing, of irrigation, of everything that eventually let human populations climb into the billions. The version of humanity that stayed home might have been more genetically diverse than the version that left. It would almost certainly have been smaller. So no, you're not reading this because someone, thousands of generations ago, walked north instead of staying put. You're reading this because they almost didn't and somehow barely they did anyway.